spent $110,000 building my daughter and her husband a life in this country, and the morning I found out the truth, she looked me dead in the eye across my own kitchen table and told me I was being dramatic. That was 8 months ago. By the time the sun went down that same day, I had already made 3 phone calls that would dismantle everything she thought she owned. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. My name is Gordon Webb. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a civil litigation lawyer in Halifax, Nova Scotia, building a practice from a 2-room office above a dry cleaner on Quinpool Road into one of the more respected boutique firms in the city. I am not a man who makes decisions quickly or emotionally. I am a man who reads the fine print. I am a man who knows exactly what words mean and exactly what silence costs you. My wife passed away from a sudden cardiac event 6 years ago this past February. We had been married for 31 years. After she died, I threw myself back into work the way grieving people do when they do not know how else to keep moving. I billed more hours in the year after her death than I had in the previous 5 combined. I also began, quietly and methodically, converting a significant portion of my practice earnings into a structured set of registered accounts and a real estate portfolio. Not because I was obsessed with money. Because I needed something to build, something I could control. My daughter is 34 years old. She married her husband 4 years ago in a ceremony I paid for entirely, down to the last floral arrangement and the late-night poutine bar that nobody ate. I will not use his name. I will call him what he is. I will call him what he is. I will call him my son-in-law. He is 37. He came to Halifax from Ontario 6 years ago, met my daughter at a conference, and within 18 months they were engaged. I liked him at first. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming when they want something from you. He laughed at the right moments. He called me by my first name, which I told him I preferred. He asked thoughtful questions about my career, my cases, the kind of structural details that flattered a man who had spent decades believing nobody his daughter's age cared about law. I should have recognized the pattern sooner. I had spent 38 years reading people in courtrooms. But you do not read your own family the same way you read opposing counsel. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself you are being cynical. You tell yourself this is your daughter and she married this man and so he must be someone worth knowing. That was my first mistake. The second mistake came 3 years ago when my son-in-law's consulting business began to struggle. He had launched it 2 years into the marriage, convincing my daughter to leave her stable position in a marketing firm to help him run it. I expressed concern at the time. My daughter told me I was being unsupportive, so I stayed quiet, and I wrote a check, $40,000, structured as a loan with a signed promissory note, because I am a lawyer and I do not write checks without paper. He paid it back 18 months later, which surprised me. I credited him for it. I should not have. I understand now that the repayment was not honesty. It was an investment in my continued trust. Because 14 months after that repayment, he came to me again. They were sitting at the kitchen table in my house, the same house I have owned for 22 years, the house my wife and I raised our daughter in. My son-in-law had printed documents. He had a projection sheet. He told me that a close friend of his from Ontario, a man he had worked with years ago in commercial real estate, had identified a development opportunity outside of Kelowna, British Columbia, a parcel of land, pre-construction investment. The returns, he said, were conservative. He used that word specifically. Conservative. He had learned enough about me to know that word would land. My daughter sat beside him nodding. She did not look nervous. She looked rehearsed. He asked me for $10,000. He explained that the minimum buy-in for the partnership unit was exactly that amount. He showed me a document on letterhead from a company called Ridgecrest Property Group, based out of Vancouver. The document had a watermark. It had a phone number. It had the name of a managing partner. It looked, at the time, completely legitimate. He said the investment would be held in trust through a federally registered corporation. He said I would receive quarterly statements. He said the projected return over 4 years was between 18 and 22%. He had calculated what that meant for my retirement, written it out on a single sheet of paper and placed it in front of me like a gift. I asked for 2 weeks to conduct my own due diligence. He said the partnership window closed in 10 days. I am a lawyer. I know what artificial urgency is. I knew it then, sitting at that table. But my daughter reached across and put her hand on my arm, and she looked at me the way she looked at me when she was 7 years old and wanted something she was not sure she would get, and I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself I had read too many fraud files over the years and it was making me paranoid. I told myself this was my daughter's future. Her husband was trying to build something for them. I transferred $110,000 from my personal investment account into the account number he provided, wired through my bank in Halifax to a numbered account at a financial institution in British Columbia. That was 16 months ago. For the first 6 months, I received quarterly statements. They were detailed. They had graphs. They showed a modest but consistent return, exactly the kind of steady, unremarkable progress that makes a person feel safe. I congratulated myself privately for having trusted my gut. I told myself the artificial urgency had simply been enthusiasm, not manipulation. Then the statements stopped. I sent an email to the address on the Ridgecrest letterhead. The message bounced back. I tried the phone number. It rang 4 times and disconnected. I asked my son-in-law about it directly. He told me there had been a change in the property group's administrative team and that the new contact information would be sent to me shortly. He was calm when he said it, completely calm. I called the Law Society of British Columbia. I asked them to run the name of the managing partner listed on the original document. The name did not appear in any registry connected to real estate law or property management in the province. I then contacted the British Columbia Securities Commission and asked them to run the corporate name. Ridgecrest Property Group had never been registered as a securities dealer or investment fund in Canada. It did not exist. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call, long enough for the late afternoon light to shift completely and the room to go dark around me. I did not turn on a lamp. I just sat there in the quiet, doing what I had trained myself to do in the worst moments of a difficult case. I separated the emotion from the evidence. I laid the facts out in a row. $110,000 transferred from my personal account. Statements received for 6 months, then silence. Corporate name does not exist in any provincial or federal registry. Contact information is dead. My son-in-law knew this man personally and vouched for the entire arrangement. The question I needed to answer was simple and devastating. Was my son-in-law a victim of his friend's fraud, or was he the architect of it? I opened my laptop and began searching. I started with the name of the friend he had mentioned, the man from Ontario who had supposedly identified the opportunity. I found him on LinkedIn within 4 minutes. He was not in real estate. He had never been in real estate. He was a project manager at a logistics company in Mississauga who had posted nothing about Kelowna, nothing about land development, and nothing connecting him to my son-in-law in any visible way. I searched the numbered corporation my son-in-law had used to structure the transfer. The corporation was real, provincially registered, with my son-in-law listed as the sole director. It had been incorporated 11 months before he first approached me with the investment proposal. The money I had transferred had gone into an account controlled by a company my son-in-law owned and operated entirely by himself. There was no Ridgecrest. There was no land parcel outside Kelowna. There was no managing partner. There was no development opportunity. There was only my son-in-law and a very good printer. I did not call my daughter that night. I sat in my dark office and I thought about the specific texture of what had just happened to me. I thought about the promissory note from the first loan, the one he had repaid. I thought about how deliberately that repayment had been timed to increase my willingness to invest a much larger sum. I thought about the fake urgency. I thought about the quarterly statements, which I now understood had been fabricated entirely to buy themselves time. I thought about my daughter sitting at that kitchen table with her hand on my arm. I needed to know how much she knew. I did not ask her directly. I am a litigation lawyer. I never ask a witness a question I do not already know the answer to. Instead, I spent the following 3 days quietly, methodically pulling every thread I could reach. I have colleagues in Vancouver who practice securities law. I called in a favor. By the end of those 3 days, I had a clear picture. The numbered corporation had moved the money through 2 transfers. A portion had gone toward the purchase of a condominium unit in Dartmouth, across the harbor from Halifax, registered in my daughter's name. Another portion had been used to pay off the remaining balance on a joint line of credit they had accumulated over the previous 2 years. A smaller amount appeared to have funded a 3-week trip to Portugal they had taken 8 months earlier, a trip I had been told was a delayed honeymoon paid for by his family. My daughter had signed the title documents for the Dartmouth condo. She knew. She had always known. On the 4th morning after I found out the truth, I drove to their house. My daughter opened the door in her housecoat. My son-in-law was sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee. I sat down across from them both without being invited to. I placed a printed copy of the corporate registry document on the table between us. I placed a copy of the condo title transfer beside it. I placed a copy of my original wire transfer confirmation on top of both. I told them I knew about Ridgecrest. I told them I knew about the corporation. I told them I knew about the condo in Dartmouth and the line of credit payoff in Portugal. My daughter looked at me for a long moment, and then she said I was being dramatic. My son-in-law said nothing. He looked at the documents on the table. He picked up his coffee cup and set it back down again. I told them I was not being dramatic. I told them I was being a lawyer. I stood up, gathered my documents, and walked back out the front door. My daughter followed me to the porch. She raised her voice. She told me this was not what it looked like. She told me the investment had simply gone sideways, and they had tried to protect the money the only way they knew how. She told me I had always been impossible to talk to about money, and that I never listened to her, and this entire situation was partly my fault for being so controlling. I did not argue with her. I simply told her she would be hearing from my office. I drove back to Halifax and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my own firm. I had a junior partner handle the initial filing to keep a layer of professional distance between my personal interest and the legal strategy. Within 48 hours, we had filed a civil claim in Nova Scotia Supreme Court for fraudulent misrepresentation, unjust enrichment, and breach of fiduciary duty. The claim named my son-in-law as the primary defendant and my daughter as a secondary party given her execution of the title transfer. We attached a copy of the original promissory note from the first loan, which had been repaid, as evidence of the established pattern of structured financial requests. We attached every statement, every email, every piece of correspondence. The filing was airtight. The second call was to my bank. I spoke with the Senior Fraud Investigation Unit. I reported the wire transfer as the product of deliberate misrepresentation and provided them with the corporate registry evidence and the fabricated investment documents. The bank escalated immediately. Within 24 hours, they had opened a formal fraud file and flagged the transaction for review by the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada. A fine track flag on a numbered corporation is not a small thing. It triggers a cascade of regulatory attention that is very difficult to quietly make disappear. The third call was to the Dartmouth Condos Property Management Company. I identified myself as the beneficial owner of the funds used to purchase the unit and informed them that the title transfer was being contested as the product of fraud. I asked them to note the dispute on the file and to immediately contact me before executing any sale, rental, or financing transaction involving the unit. They complied within the hour. Within 72 hours of walking out of my daughter's kitchen, the condo was frozen. The bank accounts connected to the corporation were under regulatory scrutiny, and a civil lawsuit had been entered into the court registry. My son-in-law called me that evening from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more. On the third call, I answered. He was controlled at first. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me this was a family matter and that dragging it into court would destroy his marriage, my daughter's well-being, and my relationship with any future grandchildren. He said the word grandchildren twice, deliberately. He knew it was the word most likely to reach me. It did not reach me. I told him the matter had already entered the court registry and that all further communication should be directed to my firm. I told him that if he or my daughter made any attempt to transfer, sell, or encumber the Dartmouth property before the litigation concluded, I would be filing for an emergency injunction before noon the following day. I told him I had 38 years of practice in this province and I knew every procedural tool available to me, and I intended to use all of them. He went quiet for a moment, then he shifted. He told me I was a bitter, lonely old man who had resented his daughter's independence for years. He told me I had always seen him as beneath her. He told me that he and my daughter had planned to pay me back once the business was profitable, and that I had now made that impossible by going nuclear over what was ultimately a business setback. He said I had never given him a real chance. He said my wife would be ashamed of what I was doing to this family. He brought my wife into it. I breathed in very slowly. I told him, in the same tone I have used in courtrooms for almost 4 decades, that he had just made his situation significantly worse. I told him I was going to add the statement about my deceased wife to my file notes with a timestamp, and that if he made any further attempts to contact me directly rather than through my firm's office, I would seek a no-contact order. Then I hung up. My daughter did not call me for 11 days. When she did call, she was crying. She said she had not known it would go this far. She said she had believed her husband when he told her the plan was legitimate, that the paperwork was real, that they intended to pay me back with interest from the profits. She said she had not understood until she saw the civil filing, the full scope of what he had done. I listened to her. I did not say anything for a long time after she finished. Then I asked her one question. I asked her when she had signed the title documents for the Dartmouth condo. She was quiet. I told her the documents were dated 6 weeks before the Ridgecrest investment closed. She had signed them before the money was even transferred, which meant she had known the plan before I had been approached. She had known what the money was for before she sat across from me at my own kitchen table and put her hand on my arm. She started crying harder. She said she had loved me and she had not wanted to hurt me, and she had told herself it would all work out. She said she was sorry, and I believe she meant it, and I also know that being sorry and being complicit are not mutually exclusive things. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I would always love her, and I told her that love did not require me to absorb $110,000 in fraud without legal consequence, and that she had made decisions as an adult, and adult decisions carry adult consequences. The litigation took 7 months. My son-in-law hired a lawyer who immediately attempted to have the claim dismissed on procedural grounds. The motion was denied. He then attempted to argue that the transfer had been a gift, not a loan or investment. The promissory note from the first transaction, the one he had so carefully repaid 3 years ago, destroyed that argument entirely. It established a pattern of structured financial arrangements between us, none of which had ever been characterized as gifts. The court ordered the Dartmouth condo sold. Every dollar of the net proceeds was applied directly to the judgment against him. The total amount recovered from the sale, combined with the regulatory freeze on the corporate accounts, came to $86,000. He was ordered to pay the remaining balance through a structured repayment plan registered against his personal credit, enforceable in any province. He and my daughter separated 4 months ago. I did not cause that. I want to be precise about this. A man who builds a fake investment company to steal money from his father-in-law and a woman who signs paperwork to help him do it have already caused their own damage. I simply refuse to let that damage continue at my expense. My daughter and I are not close right now. We talk occasionally. There is a long road ahead of us, and I do not know where it ends. What I know is that I will not rebuild a relationship on a foundation of pretending the past did not happen. Real reconciliation requires honesty from both directions. I am still waiting for hers. I have been retired for 4 months now. I closed my practice, referred my clients, and did something I have not done in 38 years. I stopped. I am writing this from a rented house on the Northumberland Strait. It is a plain wooden house, nothing fancy, with a wide porch facing the water and a wood stove in the kitchen that I have already burned through half a cord figuring out how to use properly. There is no one here who needs anything from me. The tide goes out every morning and comes back every evening and does not require my assistance or my money. I think about my wife sometimes, sitting out on that porch. I think about what she would say. She was a more forgiving person than I am, but she was also the one who taught me that generosity without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability. The greatest thing I have learned from this is not how to recognize a fraudster. I knew how to do that long before my son-in-law sat down at my kitchen table with his printed documents and his conservative returns. The thing I had to learn, the hard lesson that cost me far more than money, is that love does not immunize you against manipulation. The people who can hurt you most are the ones you have already decided to trust. And deciding that something must be true because you need it to be true is not faith. It is just hope wearing a very expensive disguise. If you believe that respecting someone means being honest with them, even when it costs you, even when the truth is inconvenient, please hit the like button and subscribe to Brocade Vengeance for more stories about standing your ground when it matters most. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house when you finally stop waiting for someone to become who you needed them to be. I felt it the evening I closed my laptop on the Northumberland Strait, the wood stove crackling, the tide pulling back from the shore the way it always does, indifferent and reliable in a way that people rarely are. I have thought a great deal about what happened with my daughter and her husband, not to punish myself with it, but because I am the kind of man who needs to understand the mechanics of a thing before he can set it down. And what I understand now, looking back with the kind of clarity that only distance can give you, is that every consequence in the story arrived exactly as it should have. My son-in-law was an intelligent man. That much I will grant him. He understood that the most effective way to steal from someone is to make them feel like they are choosing to give. He repaid the first loan precisely on schedule, not out of integrity, but out of strategy. He was building a record of trustworthiness the way a contractor builds a foundation, not because he cares about the structure, but because he needs it to hold weight later. And it worked. It worked on me, a man who had spent nearly 4 decades reading people in courtrooms. That is not a comfortable thing to admit, but here is what I have come to believe. The capacity to be deceived by someone you love is not a flaw in your character. It is evidence that you were living honestly inside the relationship, extending the kind of good faith that a real connection requires. The failure of integrity was his, not mine. He chose to exploit what I offered openly. That choice and everything that followed from it was the direct and natural result of who he had decided to be. What I had to reckon with, sitting in that dark office the night I found out the truth, was whether I had the clarity to see things as they actually were rather than as I wished them to be. That is the harder discipline. It is easy to be angry. It is much harder to be accurate. I had to look at documents instead of memories. I had to read account numbers instead of good intentions. I had to hold the evidence in my hands and follow where it led, even when it led to my daughter's signature on a title transfer dated 6 weeks before she sat beside me at my kitchen table. That is what I mean when I say that clear thinking is its own form of courage. It is not cold. It is not unfeeling. It is the refusal to let what you want to be true override what the evidence shows you. My 38 years in litigation taught me that lesson professionally. This taught me it personally. And then there is the question of what you do once you see clearly. That is where steadiness matters, not aggression, not revenge for its own sake, just the willingness to follow through on what is right, even when following through is uncomfortable, even when the person most affected by your decision is someone you have loved since the day they were born. Gordon Webb, the father, wanted to find an explanation that made this easier. Gordon Webb, the lawyer, knew there was no explanation that changed what the documents said. My daughter and I are still finding our way back to each other slowly and honestly. I do not know how far we will get, but I know that any real relationship between us has to be built on who we actually are, not on a version of me who pretends the past did not happen, and a version of her who never has to account for the choices she made. Love built on avoidance is not love. It is just shared silence. I am 67 years old, and I am sitting on a porch watching water that does not need anything from me. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.